Hello, welcome to Chapter 6 for Geography 101, and we're going to continue on with our relationships with people. And this time we're going to focus on people and the environment. And so, first of all, what is the environment, right? Environment is many things. We're going to focus on the environment for these various things as a source of economic opportunity, the meanings that we give it, and the context. And it's important to realize that it is always the background to not only our own lives, the environment that you live in, but our collective lives, our cultural, our social lives. Okay? So, again, feel free to go through these objectives on your own. I'm not going to read through them, but kind of what we're going to cover. But let's talk about environment and the meanings that we give it. How do we as a society, as a people, conceive the area around us? So, a good example I always think about, if you think about fairy tales, like Northern European fairy tales, like Hansel and Gretel, or Little Red Riding Hood, and when the character in the fairy tale enters the forest is big, it's dark, it's scary, it's where bad things happen. And that's kind of a connotation because the forest itself is inherently neutral. But the meaning that we give it, right, that it's a scary, negative, a place to be fearful, that's a concept that comes with Northern European cultures. Not every culture shares that. How do we envision the idea of getting back to nature? If I say it's time to get back to nature, what does that mean? And that might have different meanings based on who we are. We do know that the environment does affect us, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Um, People go on vacation to certain areas like the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone National Park. They go to the ocean, they go to the beach. So these have effects, and I apologize for the scratching. Allergy season is upon us. We're going to look at three basic forms of this, okay, and kind of explore these in detail and how society um, views the environment. So just kind of let's get into this. So let's talk about hunter-gathering societies and their economic relationships, their view of sacred space. And then hunter-gathering society, right, like we viewed with the movie, where you're not settled in one place for agriculture. The world, the environment around you, is seen as just yet another part of all of life. Everything is alive, everything is living, everything has spirituality, and there's no distinction between heaven and hell and earth because everything is a sacred space. In other words, the flowers and the trees and the animals and humans are all part of one interconnected thing. So we kind of make fun of this, they call them tree spirits. We may kind of make light of this, but in this worldview, there is no difference between where we live as people and the world around us. There is no idea of getting back to nature because nature and you are one. It definitely interacts. A great example right here. This image kind of represents a Native American belief. So a lot of Native American tribes have a very different creation story than the Judeo-Christian, God made the earth in 7 days kind of issue. And in this worldview, all of life, everything that we see, that we perceive, the world around us is really the back of a large turtle that is floating through the cosmos. So we are all part of this large turtle floating through space, if you will. And that kind of just ties in the fact that everything is connected to one living thing. Okay. Now, what happens when people who hold these type of environmental views, hunter-gatherer societies, they have a sacred space. What happens when they encounter other societies that have different environmental views, which we'll talk about a little bit later? So a great example is when Native Americans came into contact with Europeans in the 15th century, the 16th century, right? Um, when the Europeans came to North America, they did not know what was beyond the coast. They would sail their boats. If they wanted to come inland, they required Native American guides to show them around. This is the way this river goes. This is how you get there. And the Native Americans greatly contributed to the mapping of North America. We envision these explorers drawing these maps, but if it wasn't for the Native Americans acting as guides to help them out, it would never have happened. And this was kind of a two-way street. In exchange for the Native American knowledge of the land, of the environment that was given to the Europeans gave them trade goods, They gave them weapons, they gave them guns, they gave them support against their enemies, other tribes. And so while this benefited both in the short term, in the long term, this encouraged and enabled more Europeans to come to North America and to better infiltrate the country, which led to the downfall of Native American civilization. So in the end, this relationship ended up to be very destructive. And that is a theme that we have seen over and over again, is that when people who have a sacred space kind of environmental view come in contact with other societies that maybe have a different view, like we'll talk about, it usually doesn't work out too well for them. Okay. So another example right here is Lewis and Clark. So if you're not familiar with American history, in 1803, the Mississippi River was the western boundary of the United States, and Thomas Jefferson purchased basically what is the Great Plains right here from France in 1803. And we knew a little bit about this, but there had really been no white or European people between this line right here and the coast. This was all unexplored country. And when I say unexplored, Native Americans obviously knew it. They lived there. So Lewis and Clark were sent by the president to travel up the Missouri River as far as it would go, and then see if there was an easy way to the Pacific coast. The desire was to be able to, easily trade across North America. When North's first winter, Lewis and Clark got as far as here, which is current-day Dakota. They couldn't go any further. It was winter. They had to find a place to stay. And there was this tribe of Native Americans named the Mandans who lived in huge villages along the river. Villages of like 3,000 to 4,000 people. In the winter, they would settle along here. And then in the spring, they would go out and they would be nomads on the plains. Well, while they were there, Lewis and Clark spoke with them, and the Mandans told them what was ahead of them on the river. They told them where the waterfalls were and the rapids, the areas to avoid, where the best hunting was for food, the ways to get through the mountains. This is actually an example of some of the maps that were drawn by the members of Lewis and Clark's expedition based on information given to them by the Mandans. But unfortunately, as all of these relationships tended to be, and we've talked about, it was destructive. Lewis and Clark, in the next year, made it to the West Coast, and then the last 3 years later, they came back. So they came back this way. I think it was 3 years after they had spent the winter. And they were looking forward to seeing their friends, the Mandans. But when they got there were no Native Americans around. The villages were empty, gone, completely gone. Turns out what happened was 3 years prior, when they spent the winter with them, before they left, somebody in Lewis and Clark's expedition passed on a virus, probably the flu or maybe chickenpox, and it spread like wildfire through a pandemic through the tribe and decimated them. Those that did not die, there were so few left, they had to basically leave and go live with other tribes as they were too few to live on their own. And so that very relationship that was beneficial at the beginning ended up being the cause of the end of this Native American tribe. Well, as I've said, there are actually other viewpoints besides the sacred view. And the next one is the idea of productive space, in viewing the environment as productive. And this begins when we start seeing agriculture as the human way of life, settled agriculture. One of the things with this is that we see the earth as something bountiful to provide for us. The earth gives her resources to us to sustain us. And part of that is reinforced by the cycle of festivals. You have festivals in the spring to encourage the fertility of the earth. You have festivals in the fall to thank the earth for her bounty, right? And this may sound primitive, but if you think about Easter, which is a Christian festival, is basically the spring renewal. It's the rebirth, if you will, in the Christian view of Christ, but it also talks about the rebirth of life. I mean, that is why the rabbit, the Easter bunny, is the symbol of Easter, because what do bunnies do but rebirth many, many times? Thanksgiving in the fall is thanking for the harvest. So you see this switch to culture, okay? And in this worldview, fertility and sacrifice, you must work hard for the earth to provide. Some cultures went so far as to sacrifice animals or even people. In exchange, the sacrifice ensured fertility. That if you sacrificed work, if you sacrificed effort, if you sacrificed animals or even people, the return was fertility and continued sustenance. Okay? This also begins the commodification of agriculture. So not just growing food to eat, but now growing things that you can also sell. So growing more food than you can eat to sell, or growing things that you can't eat, like cotton. You can't eat cotton, but you can sell it. And what happens is land itself, for the first time, begins to become a commodity. You can buy and sell land. Hunters and gatherers don't own land. When they're done, they move on. They use what they need, they move on. But if you are a farmer and you have a very good area of land, you want to basically keep that land because it has value, it provides value. And having that worldview is part of that. It's a way to not only have value, but to accumulate value, wealth. You can get more land and then transfer it to your family. We're going to pause right here, and then we're going to move on to the third environmental view that we'll cover.